Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's informational session about the Humanities DC 2025 Community Grants Opportunities. We are so excited to open up our 2025 opportunities for all of you, and we are looking forward to the presentation. Thank you for joining us this evening. Next slide, please. So at Humanities DC, there are a bunch of us. My name is Hilary Steen, and I'm one of the community grants managers. Leah, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Leah Gage, and I am the other community grants manager at Humanities DC. And Loy, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Loy Nemar, Director of Grant Making and Programs. Lovely to see you all.
Great. And another member of our team is Jasper Collier, and he is the DC Oral History Collaborative Senior Manager. You might not interact with him too much on the applicant side, but if you end up getting a grant from us, then you might work very closely with him. And so the four of us are the grants team at Humanities DC, and your main points of contact throughout this entire process will be myself and Leah, the two community grants managers. And so we want to also know who you all are. We have about 12-ish people on the line, and we're just curious about who you are, what brought you here today. If you have any ideas for any projects you're thinking of, feel free to share with us verbally or use the chat. And whoever wants to be brave and go first, you're more than welcome to.
I'll go. My name is Marion Woodfolk Simmons. I'm a fourth generation Washingtonian, but I live in Montgomery County now. And I am currently researching the experience of Black firefighters doing integration of the DC Fire Department. And I got interested in that subject because my father was a fireman during that time, and he never talked about his experience. But I learned some information shortly before he passed, which made me want to learn more about it and preserve that piece of history. So that's why I started the project.
Great, thank you.
Hey, I'll jump in next. My name's Athena Angelos, and I'm a first generation Washingtonian. And I've been an independent photo researcher for 33 years now. And a few years ago, I acquired a really awesome photo collection, and it's all portraits of Washingtonians, and also World War II material, because I think the photographer was also a printer in the government office that printed the Army Signal Corps material during World War II. And so this guy, I think, was, he was a portrait photographer who was not with the Scurlock studio. And it's this beautiful capsule of portraits and other stuff happening in DC, almost exclusively of Black Washingtonians from the 1940s. And so I have a big, huge, crazy idea about how I'd like to get school kids involved in helping to process the collection and then turn it over to whoever will take it. But I don't want kids to miss the opportunity to do something with the raw material. And I just hope, my idea is not too complicated. So that's why I'm here.
Great, thank you.
May I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I want to follow Miss Angelo's comments and urge her to keep the DC History Center in mind as a recipient for those photos. Of the ideal place to put them. I will briefly just say that I am representative here of a project to establish a museum of the Watergate. A Watergate museum, and it it's a bantling, it's an infant, it is barely taken its first breath. We're trying to create a plan for it that will enable us to seek some major funding. The purpose is not simply to foreground the Watergate crisis of the 70s. It's to use that crisis to set up a museum that deals with civic rectitude and deceit and corruption, number one. And it's also to bring attention to the significant influence that the architecture of these buildings down by the river where I live, and also the urban planning, landscape planning aspect of it, which were also very significant. The architect, Luigi Moretti, is a star historic architect in Italy. This is his only venture here, his only built project in the United States. So in that sense, it has architectural significance. Boris Timchenko, who was the landscape architect, was very important. We've gathered advisory council, advisory committee of people who were involved, who are still alive, and scholars of these matters. And so we'll be seeking support from HumanitiesDC to see if we can move this along to the next stage of its development.
Great, thank you. You have time for one more, if anyone wants to be the last one for now to share out.
I'll go next. Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Atia Bar-Lacey. I too am a fourth generation Washingtonian, and I have had the privilege and pleasure of attending three very historical, I would believe, impactful institutions: Shaw Junior High School, Duke Ellington School of the Arts, and Howard University. And I grew up during the crack epidemic, was very much so impacted by that very tumultuous time in our city. And as some of you may know, Shaw Junior High School is now the new Banneker High School. And there's really no historical context for the Shaw experience. Shaw Junior High School, of course, was at its peak during the crack epidemic. I think when I attended, there were probably about 1,200 students there, with a wait list of probably close to 1,000. I actually wrote an article for the Washington paper, and I was told that it was one of the most read articles that they've had, online articles. And so it really did make leave a big imprint for our city. And I'm interested in just hearing what the qualifications for the grant are, because I would like to memorialize my experience growing up in DC during the crack epidemic, being a student at Shaw and then going to Duke Ellington, and then making it out of that time period and being able to go to Howard University. I have a daughter who's graduating in May. So I would like to just figure out how can I memorialize that experience and bring it to life. I think a lot of what we're seeing, even with our youth now, they're having this experience, but they have no context to put it in. Many of them are not even familiar with that whole crack epidemic and how it really did interrupt our families and our communities. And so I'm really interested in learning more about the grant, the criteria, and how I can use the funding to start to just memorialize that whole time period during the 80s and 90s in the District of Columbia.
Great, thank you. And we have one person who put their information into the chat. For anyone else who we weren't able to call on today, if you want to type information about yourselves into the chat to introduce yourself to the group, you're more than welcome to throughout the presentation. But I will read a little bit of what's in the chat right now. So Karen from Christ House is the organization is celebrating 40 years of their work meeting the needs of DC's unhoused men with acute medical needs. Their founder passed away over a few months ago, and her work truly changed the community healthcare in DC. So Christ House is looking to celebrate that history as well as her impact of the Church of the Savior, which helped create so many of DC's most important social service agencies. So a lot of great projects.
Okay, should we move forward? And so let's talk a little bit about what the humanities are. So actually, this is an opportunity, and Hillary, if you can help me out by looking in the chat. Does anybody wish to kind of share what you think of as the humanities, or how would you define the humanities?
I would say humanities is like art and history.
Yeah, okay. So art, history, any other thoughts?
I think it's in this context especially, it seems like it's also about making connections of with people. It's about people and the human experience. Um, and yeah, just by looking at some of the other projects that you guys have supported, it's yeah, growing awareness of our communities and yeah, bringing people together.
And the culture, I would say, the culture
Yes,
of the
culture.
community.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Absolutely.
I would agree. Art culture with the historical context, within a historical context is how I would define it.
Sometimes it's defined as what is not the natural and physical sciences, but that's a negative definition. It's really what the French called part of the human sciences, and it's knowledge. They're the fields, the subjects, the disciplines that deal with human life rather than others. So it's art, the history and the literature, art history, music history, languages, philosophy, the normal subjects in that part of college and university education, school education. Very hard to define otherwise, though.
And in the chat, Marwa says commemorating people's stories and promoting cross-cultural understanding.
Beautiful. Well, you all definitely have a very comprehensive understanding of the humanities, and I loved the recurring theme of what I heard about human. The first piece of that word humanities is human. And what we really see the humanities are as like a framework for us to tell stories about ourselves, about our history, about our communities. I heard culture mentioned, I heard history mentioned several times. And so, human stories, understanding human experience, understanding what makes us human and what humans make. That's kind of how we see the humanities. And a helpful way that I like to think about the humanities and that we try to talk about here at Humanities DC is thinking about some of the disciplines that make up the humanities. And if you do submit an application, you will note that there are questions that ask, what discipline is the primary discipline for your project? So this is kind of a helpful way to think about it. Our past, we try to understand our past through history. I heard history mentioned, anthropology and archaeology. Those are key disciplines within the humanities. Public expression of our stories. We do this through literature. We do it through language and linguistics, as well as art, studying art criticism, art history, and theory of art. And the meanings and values of our stories, which we understand through ethics, philosophy, comparative religion, and the law. And so I have linked in this document, which we can share out later, the National Endowment for Humanities definition of humanities. It very much focuses on these disciplines, so I won't click on it and go into all of that now. But I think that'll be a helpful way for us to think moving forward about the humanities. And I'll just note that I do see some lines and things on the screen. We're not totally sure where that's coming from, so we apologize if that's distracting at all. Trying to figure out how to fix that while we're also recording this session. So thank you for your patience tonight. So we've talked about the humanities. Now, what is Humanities DC? Just very briefly, for those of you who may or may not be familiar with Humanities DC, our goal is, as DC's Humanities Council, we're one of 56 state councils in the nation that receives funding via the National Endowment for Humanities, as well as DC's Commission on the Arts and Humanities. Our goal is really to connect curious people with bold questions, to answer and ask powerful stories about our vibrant community. And these are some themes that we've really been emphasizing this year. And so I want to highlight a new logo that we created, talking about curious minds, bold questions, powerful stories. And we do this in a number of different ways. But one of the key ways that we do this is through our own curated public programs that Humanities DC plans and puts on. So that includes our community journalism program and our independent practitioner fellowship. And both of these currently are open. They opened along with our community grants. And so I want to point that out to you and ask you to take a look at our website. If you go to the humanitiesdc.org site and click on programs, you'll see more about those. But in addition to that, we have a year-round culture series that we host monthly throughout the city. We have our DC Oral History Collaborative, which we'll go into a little bit more. And in addition to the Independent Practitioner Fellowship, we also have district fellowships where folks can come and work at Humanities DC. So in addition to all that, we also offer our community grants, and that's what we'll be talking about primarily this evening. So each year, Humanities DC gives out just over $1 million in grant funding across 6 programs. This past year, we gave about 63 grants. This coming year, we're thinking we'll give a little bit more than that. But generally about $1 million, and we fund individuals and organizations across all 8 wards of DC. And those grants are now open. Our first cycle is open, and I will take us to the next page where we can celebrate that. Our grants are now open. They opened last week, and hopefully you all are aware of that if that's what brought you here this evening. So cycle 1 is open now, and that includes 4 of our program grants. And we'll go into these in greater detail, but those grants opened last week, and the applications will be due February 18th by 5:59 p.m. And so those grants are our Visions, Projects, and Events grants, Community, Culture, and Heritage, Oral History Interviewing, and Beyond the Archives. We'll open a second cycle of grants starting March 4th, and that will include our General Operating Support Grant for humanities organizations and continuing oral history projects, which is part of the DC Oral History Collaborative. So make a note of that. As I said, all of this information is up on our website. And now we'd like to go into a little bit more detail about each of these grant programs, the eligibility requirements, understanding the project scope, etc. So let's start with the DC Oral History Collaborative grants.
All right. So throughout this presentation, and if you have known about Humanities DC for a while, you might have heard the acronym DCOHC, which stands for the DC Oral History Collaborative. And this focuses on the art of interviewing through oral history interviews, which are special interviews that ask about people's life stories. So instead of a narrow series of questions like what you might find in journalism or sociology, this takes the broad overview of someone's entire life and how someone's life might intersect with historical events. It adds more perspectives to our historical record. And so the DC Oral History Collaborative is a collaboration that we have with the DC Public Library. And it allows us to work to preserve the history of Washington's residents and communities through oral history interviewing, via grant making, training, and also a lot of public projects. So again, if you've known about Humanities DC, you've probably heard us talk about DCOHC before. And in 2025, there are 3 grant opportunities under this umbrella of DCOHC, which is Oral History Interviewing and Beyond the Archives, which are both available in Cycle 1, as well as Continuing Oral History Projects available in Cycle 2. So the first one is for oral history interviewing, which again is in cycle 1. And funded projects explore DC life, history, and culture through oral history interviews with the people who have lived it. So some people, as you were introducing yourselves, I was definitely thinking of how great an oral history project might be for your own project, for example. It is open to DC-based individuals, community groups, and nonprofit organizations, and you can receive up to $8,000 for your project. However, you can also receive an additional $5,000, which would be focused on translation of transcripts specifically into different languages. Project period for this grant will start on May 1st of 2025 and go through January 31st of 2026. There are various requirements that are involved with this kind of grant, which we call deliverables. So in addition to actually conducting the oral history interviews, in order for us to be able to archive everything in the DC Public Library, there are a few deliverables that are required, which would include the actual media files of the interviews, plus transcripts, indexes, release forms, and metadata for each interview. And if what I just said makes no sense, that is totally fine. All grantees under this grant program receive in-depth, in-person oral history training. Over 3 days, they're in person in early to mid-May. And throughout the entire project period, you will work very closely with us on staff as well as other DCOHC consultants every step of the way. So many applicants and grantees for this program have never done oral history interviews before actually receiving this grant. And so I don't want to make this seem really intimidating. We provide very hands-on assistance for this kind of grant. And the application for oral history interviewing is due on February 18th of 2025. And so just wanted to provide 2 examples of some current grantees. One is with Leslie Arun Walsh, and her project is called Bank on Her, exploring the effects of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So Leslie and her team are interviewing adult women who lived in the 1970s to see how their lives were changed after the passing of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which allowed women to have more financial independence. Another project is with grantee Shilpi Malinowski, and her project is called Mount Pleasant, The Rise and Fall of Cultural Community Centers. And Shilpi is interviewing residents of Mount Pleasant to tell the stories of their neighborhood and their relationship to various community institutions, such as the Latin American Youth Center, Bancroft Elementary School, and Bell Multicultural High School. Another grant opportunity under DCOHC is called Continuing Oral History Projects. And this is very similar to the oral history interviewing grants that I just talked about, but only those who have actually completed already funded HumanitiesDC oral history projects are eligible for this grant. This is for those already funded individuals and organizations who want to collect and archive more oral history interviews for that same project. And so just like with the previous grant that I just described, you can receive up to $8,000 plus the additional $5,000 specifically for a translation of transcripts. The project period is a little bit later because this is in cycle 2. So that would start on July 1st, 2025 through March 31st of 2026. And that application is not open just yet. It will open up on March 4th and will be due on May 1st of 2025. And so one example of a current grantee in this grant program is Claude Elliott, and his project is called Creating Space and Opportunities, DC Black-owned/managed art galleries and spaces. So Claude has been working on this project for a few years, and his interviews are of Black artists who forged careers between the 1970s and the 1990s talking about the vitality of Black art spaces as an important sector of DC's landscape.
Okay, and then the third grant opportunity that's part of the DC Oral History Collaborative Grants is called Beyond the Archives. So this grant is intended, it's eligible for individuals, community groups, and nonprofits. The maximum award amount is $12,000. And this grant is really intended to take existing oral history recordings that are in an archive and pull them out of the archive and present them publicly. And so when we say archive, that could be the People's Archive. It could be Dig DC at the public library. It could also be a folder on your desktop of oral histories that you've collected or that a family member has collected. It could be something else at your organization or at a completely separate archive. But the key to this grant is that it's really intended to take existing oral histories. This grant does not fund the collection of new oral histories. So this project period would begin May 1st of 2025 and end April 30th of 2026. So again, examples of this project might include exhibitions. We've seen folks use existing oral histories to create podcasts, performances, maybe listening stations as kind of an exhibit, public presentations, use in films, etc. So those are some ways that folks have used that grant, and applications for this project are due February 18th. And some examples from this year, the 1882 Foundation created a curriculum for K through 12 learners that utilizes already recorded oral histories that really span a course of 50 years of Chinatown, DC Chinatown residents. So using the stories that were collected with those oral histories, they're creating a curriculum, they're implementing the curriculum with recordings of the oral histories to try to bring them to life and bring this history to life for K through 12 learners. The Cleveland and Woodley Park Village received a grant from us a couple years ago to collect oral histories that were archived of their residents. And they are using this grant to now take those oral histories and create like a public visual display featuring the photos of the narrators, web pages, and QR codes that will take you to recordings of their interviews. So those are some examples of ways past grantees have used oral histories to create public projects. Okay, another grant program. This is outside of the DC Oral History Collaborative Grants. This is the Community Culture and Heritage Grant. This also is available in Cycle 1. This is eligible for individuals, community groups, and nonprofit organizations based in DC. The maximum award amount for this grant is $10,000, and the project period again spans May 1st, 2025 to April 30th, 2026. So these projects are really intended to focus on grassroots stories, interpretations of DC history and culture that feature local historians, community historians. It may be, you know, the person on your blocks and their internal history of the community at hand. The goal of this grant is really to capture kind of a grassroots storytelling, untold stories from DC's culture bearers and individuals in the city. So examples of this could be panel discussions, multimedia projects like podcasts or videos, creation of educational materials or curriculum, lesson plans, walking tours. And the other key to this grant that's cool is that grantees who receive this grant take part in an annual showcase that HumanitiesDC plans. In the last couple of years, it's been at the Anacostia Arts Center. Grantees will exhibit their own project. They'll have a public forum to speak briefly about their project and how they use the funds, and talk to community members about their work and hopefully make new connections. So this application is also due February 18th. Couple examples from this year. We gave a community culture and heritage grant to Mark Beckford, who with his team planned the Caribbean American Museum takeover that honored the contributions of DC's 8,000 plus strong Caribbean American community. It was an immersive experience that included music and dance. It included panel discussions. There was an exhibit, performance art. It was a really cool event that took place earlier this summer. And another project that we funded through this grant is the Fort Totten and Lamond Riggs Historical Tapestry Project. So Michelle Herman and her partner Stephanie Mills Trice, her working partner, created this photographic publication that uses stories collected from the Lamond Riggs and Fort Totten neighborhoods. If you go to the Lamond Riggs library right now, you can see this tapestry, this heritage wall that was created. So this is kind of a continuation of that project that will create an actual written publication using those stories. So again, just a couple examples. And visions.
And another opportunity is called Visions, Projects and Events. And Visions projects connect the public with humanities research, knowledge, and/or ideas. Projects might be connected to national or global issues, but the primary themes and the audience for these projects are based in DC. And these are large-scale, broad projects typically, so they might be feature-length documentary films, festivals and conferences, curricula for students, tours, and exhibits. So it is very similar to community culture and heritage, but whereas community culture and heritage is more focused on smaller scale grassroots, Visions allows you to expand that a little bit further. This opportunity is only available to DC-based nonprofit organizations. If you're an individual or an informal group without 501c3 status, but you're still interested in Visions, you must apply through a fiscal sponsor. And we'll talk about fiscal sponsors a little bit later in the presentation. The maximum award is $25,000, so it's definitely one of our largest grant opportunities. And that larger maximum award amount reflects the fact that these kinds of projects are broad scale. The project period starts on May 1st of 2025 through April 30th of 2026, and the application is due on February 18th of 2025. And so as you are trying to figure out perhaps like if you want to apply to Visions or community culture and heritage, just keep that scope in mind of what you hope your project to be. And Leia and I are always available if you have questions, if you're trying to decide between the two, because there are some similarities between them. And so 2 examples. The first is with an organization called Rainbow History Project. And their project is called Gay Pride in DC, 50 Years of Protests and Parties. So they are creating an exhibit on the history of DC Pride that will be displayed during World Pride next year. And they'll also create an accompanying online portal. And the physical exhibit will be evergreen content, which will hopefully be used around the city years into the future. And another grantee is Archaeology in the Community, and their project was called 2024 DC Day of Archaeology Festival. So this project supported initiatives during the first ever DC Archaeology Month, and they hosted events throughout the city throughout the month in partnership with other institutions.
So a new grant that we are offering this year is our General Operating Support Grant. So last year we offered a capacity building grant as well as the Youth in the Humanities grant. This General Operating Support kind of takes the place of those 2 grants. This, in addition, similar to Visions, this grant is only eligible for nonprofit organizations. However, it's a little bit more narrow than that. This grant is only for humanities-focused nonprofits, and particularly humanities-focused nonprofits with budgets of $2 million or less. We don't allow fiscal sponsors for this grant opportunity because it is intended to support an organization's general operations. So the maximum award for this grant is $25,000. The project period would last between July 1st, 2025 to April 30th, 2026. The goal of this grant being general operating support is really to just shore up the general operations of humanities organizations in an effort to really strengthen the humanities landscape within DC. So in this application, applicants need not propose a project, a specific distinct project, but really these funds are intended just for the general operations, and the application questions will reflect that. This application will open in our next cycle. So this will be March 4th, and it'll be due May 1st, 2025. So you may be wondering, if you've signed on tonight, if we are no longer supporting youth-focused organizations or youth-focused projects because we got rid of the Youth in the Humanities grant. And that is not the case. One of the reasons that we decided to move to just a general operating support grant is really to keep those eligibility requirements as simple as possible and help folks kind of understand more easily what projects or what grants they're eligible for. We still want to support youth-focused projects. We still want to support youth-focused humanities organizations. And so for all of our program grants that are in cycle 1, Visions, Community Culture and Heritage, all of the oral history grants, all of those grant projects may focus on youth communities. They may engage with youth. Their target audience may be youth. As well as the fact that our general operating support grant is still open to youth-focused humanities organizations as long as they meet the other eligibility requirements. And so I just want to provide a couple of examples. We still support DC Scores. This is a picture of last year's Poetry Slam. DC Scores is an organization that supports young poets in the city by providing engagement, helping them to create poetry. They received a Visions grant this past year. That's definitely a youth-focused project we would want to support. This next picture is of Zitkala Sa. Her picture is here because her story is part of a community culture and heritage project that we supported called the Great Person Series. And this is intended for K through 8 learners, teaching them about specific great persons who are part of DC's cultural landscape. And lastly, 826DC is a fantastic youth-focused organization. They also received a Visions grant from us this past year to support their work, to support youth literacy and writing programs. So that covers all of our grants. So let's move on to some of the more general eligibility requirements.
Great. So some of you might have already reviewed some of the requests for proposals or RFPs on our website, but I wanted to take a moment to talk about something that is required for 3 of the grant projects beyond the archives, community culture and heritage, and visions, and that is the humanities scholar/community expert. So everyone who applies for those 3 grants has to have a scholar or expert who is knowledgeable about the proposed subject matter to inform the project design, implementation, and/or evaluation of the project. Scholars can have either formal training and academic experience, so perhaps they're a college professor, for example, and/or they have to have lived experience through their personal or community heritage. So perhaps it's someone who has lived in a neighborhood for 50 years, they know everyone on the block. They could be considered a humanities scholar in this case because of their lived experience. The scholar/expert lends legitimacy or intellectual authority to the project. In some cases, the project director, so the person who will be leading the overall project, can also serve as the humanities scholar. And if you want to do that, then just explain that in the application. Otherwise, you can have 2 separate people. Your community scholar does not have to live in DC to expand the possible population for choosing this person.
We mentioned fiscal sponsorship a couple of times. So as we, just to kind of talk about that specifically and go through some of the grant programs and whether fiscal sponsorship is an option. So as we mentioned, the new General Operating Support Grant, fiscal sponsors are not eligible for this grant. Applicants to this program must be 501c3 nonprofit organizations. Other than that, though, fiscal sponsors are eligible for all of our other grant programs. And so we encourage you to think about, if you're an individual thinking about applying for a grant and you decide you want to work with a fiscal sponsor, we ask that you kind of explore the implications of whether you would do that or not on your own. In particular, because we're not able to provide tax advice. As individuals who receive grants, this can be a concern for some individuals, and that may be a reason to work with fiscal sponsors. In addition, though, there's the Visions Grant, which is only eligible to nonprofit organizations. So if you're an individual thinking about applying for that grant, applying through a fiscal sponsor would be the only way that you could apply for that funding. So at HumanitiesDC, individuals requesting $13,000 or less are not required to apply through fiscal sponsors. You may still apply through an individual as yourself. If you're a community group that doesn't have 501c3 status, that may be an informal group, or you may be working toward that status, but you haven't reached it yet, you can also still apply for funding. If you're applying for Visions, you'd want to find a nonprofit fiscal sponsor. But if you would rather just apply more informally you would just need to identify one individual to serve as the main grantee in that project. We do have some organizations that we've worked with as fiscal sponsors in the past. So if you're interested in working with a fiscal sponsor, but you don't have one identified, please reach out to us and we can try to help you identify one. HumanitiesDC does not get involved in the fiscal sponsor-sponsee relationship other than the requirement that fiscal sponsors may not take more than 10% of a HumanitiesDC grant for their own administrative fees. And so that's outlined in the RFPs, and we're happy to kind of talk through that a little bit more and explain why that is. But other than that, HumanitiesDC does not engage with fiscal sponsors and sponsees. We really encourage folks to create that relationship amongst each other, perhaps to create some kind of a written document or contract. We have a letter that a template that you may use to kind of inform us that you're working with a fiscal sponsor. Other than that, though, the other thing to keep in mind is that if you are working with a fiscal sponsor, the fiscal sponsor has to meet the same requirements as any grantee. So they must be based in DC, have a physical DC address. A sponsored individual must also live in DC or have a DC address. Someone in Maryland, for example, who wanted to apply for funding wouldn't be able to apply through a fiscal sponsor because the grantee must be a DC resident, or a DC-based organization. So if you have specific questions about that, please let us know. We're happy to talk about that. I see Hillary dropped in the chat that we'll have a Q&A. So if there's specific questions around this, please keep those in mind, and we're happy to talk more about this sometimes confusing issue.
And so with that, we realized that we just threw out a lot of information to all of you. So here's a quick, non-comprehensive guide, which can be a good way to quickly see certain eligibility requirements and what kinds of projects are funded under each grant program. This presentation and these slides will be available on our website pretty soon. So you don't need to take a picture of this unless you want to, but this is a quick and easy way for you to see which kind of grant you could theoretically receive.
Okay, so I just want to talk briefly about the RFP before we open it up for questions. So when we're talking about the RFP, we're talking about the request for proposals, which is a document that we have on our website for each grant program. I strongly encourage all of you, if you're applying, to read the RFP. It seems like a lengthy and difficult document, but There are so many details that we encourage you to read the whole thing. That said, I have a couple, we've outlined a couple places that we really strongly encourage you to look at in the RFP when you're reviewing it, that will really impact each grant program that you're looking at. So applicant eligibility is a section that's in every RFP that will tell you what your requirements are for applying, whether you can be an individual or an organization, to consider whether to apply with a fiscal sponsor. It will talk about those DC residency requirements as well. The funding scope will give detailed guidance on the intention behind the grant program and what it is that makes up a successful project for this grant program. And so that's something that we strongly encourage you to take a look at. We also include the weighted review criteria. We use individual community members to review all of our grants. All funding decisions are made externally, so staff, board are not making those grant decisions. Those are made by individual volunteers who review our grants for a small honorarium. And they use a rubric that relates directly to the application questions. So this will give you a sense of how much weight is behind each of these questions. What is it that reviewers are going to be looking for each of your answers? This information is in the RFP as well as the direct application to give you kind of very clear reference on what these questions are looking for. Eligibility requirements, we mentioned that. A note on submitting multiple applications. I don't think we've really touched on that tonight, but this year, if you wish to apply for 2 grants in cycle 1, you may do so as long as one of those grants is for the oral history interviewing grant. So we want to encourage folks to apply for that grant. We want to encourage more oral history gathering, and that is why folks can apply to that grant in addition to a Community Culture and Heritage grant, Visions grant, or a Beyond the Archives grant. Grantees can only accept 1 grant. So if you applied to 2 grants and you received them both, you would need to choose which one you wanted to accept. So that's something to think about. But you may apply to 2 of those grant programs if you wish. If you are a current HumanitiesDC grantee, you may apply for funding, and the RFP will go into that in more detail. But basically, because 2024 grantees grant period will go beyond the cycle 1 application due date, the requirements are slightly different this year, but we want to allow 2024 grantees to apply for funding. You may still do so. You'll just need to make sure that your project is completely closed out, all funding spent and or returned to HumanitiesDC before you would be able to receive any 2025 funding. The RFP goes into allowable costs. This is really important for the section in the application where you're filling out your budget and thinking about what you would apply these funds to in your project. So, for example, across the board, something HumanitiesDC cannot fund is food. And that's important to keep in mind if you're hosting an event or if you have volunteers and you need to provide refreshments. If you were to do that, that would need to be funded outside of HumanitiesDC. We provide details on ADA compliance and accessibility. Not all applicants are subject to the same requirements, and so the RFP will give you more details around this. It talks about how to apply. We use a fully online application system. It's a grant management system that folks can log into and gives you access to all of the application questions. And the RFP will also talk about the process after you apply. So how long does the review process take? What does it entail? As well as the grant award terms and what would happen if you were to receive a grant, what the reporting requirements are. For example, all grantees have to submit some form of an interim report as well as a final report. And the RFP will go into that in great detail.
So speaking of the post-application, wanted to talk a little bit more about the whole application review process. So if you submit an application through our grants portal, we review them for eligibility. So that's Leia and I typically, and we will see if your project can theoretically get funded. So for example, if your applying on behalf of an organization, we check your 501c3 status, for example. If your application is eligible, then that moves on to the next stage, which is the external review process. So just like Leah said, reviewers are community members who have strong ties to the humanities in DC. So us on staff, as well as the Humanities DC board, does not choose the grantees. It's these reviewers. Reviewers score applications based off of the review criteria, the weighted criteria, which were listed in the application as well as in all the requests for proposals. After that, all eligible applications are told if they received funding or not, roughly 8 weeks after the application deadline. This is done after our board affirms that the review process was followed. It is after us on staff do a post-external reviewer review of certain pieces of your application. There are several steps to go through in this whole process, but you will be told approximately 8 weeks after the application deadline if you receive funding or not, which is pretty fast in nonprofit world. But we pride ourselves that we're able to go very thoroughly and quickly through this whole process. If you end up receiving funds, you're chosen for funding, you will receive those funds roughly 2 weeks after you're notified that you are a new grantee. Regarding the actual review process, if you are interested in reviewing applications, more information is found on our website. You are allowed to be both an applicant and a grant reviewer. You would just not review applications for the same grant program that you apply to for fairness reasons. And many applicants, grantees, and future applicants are also grant reviewers or have been so in the past. Reviewers get a lot out of this experience. They learn about cool ideas and cool things that are happening all around our city. And they also get a stronger idea of what makes a strong application because that is what they're evaluating. It's also a great networking opportunity to work with different humanists all over the DC area. And also, all reviewers who complete the review process receive a $250 honorarium as a thank you for volunteering. If you want to learn more about the application review process and what it takes to be a grant reviewer, highly encourage you to look at our website, and always happy to answer questions as well.
So we provide a lot of different kinds of assistance to applicants. And this being one of them, we have this information session, which is being recorded in addition to several other information sessions. We have them listed here, but they're also available on our website. If you go to the grant opportunities page, that first link will take you to all of the different information sessions, and we may book other ones in the future. We also offer virtual office hours, and you can sign up. That's also linked on the website. You can take a look at the calendar and find a time about 20 to 30 minutes to speak with me or with Hillary about your project and get some specific questions answered, go through your application, whatever. We have an FAQ document, which is also up on the website. Our emails are here. They're also available on the website. We do respond frequently to emails, so please do reach out to us directly. We welcome that. There's several information sessions here. We have two kind of different sorts of information sessions. General information sessions about all of our grant opportunities, like tonight's. We have another one tomorrow afternoon, as well as a few coming up in the community. One, 3 in January, so one at the Anacostia Arts Center in Ward 8, one at the Woodridge Library in Ward 5, one at the MLK Library in Ward 2. We're working on booking one at a location in Ward 7. Those will be general and offer opportunities to answer questions about all of our grant programs. Then we also offer grant-specific virtual sessions. So the week of January 13th, all of these will take place. They will all be recorded and uploaded to our website as well if you're unable to make it. But these sessions go into much greater depth on each of the grant programs. We go through the application questions. We talk about how reviewers will be reviewing these specific questions, what they're going to be looking for, what the specific review requirements are. And we find these sessions to be really helpful if you've had a chance to start your application and can come in with some ready questions about your project, maybe interpretation of certain questions or things like that. Cycle 2 will do the same thing. We haven't booked those yet, but please do stay tuned if you're interested in the GOS grant or the continuing oral history grant. And now it's your turn. So please, if you have questions, you can drop them in the chat. Hillary, I can now see the chat, just so you know. And or you can just unmute yourself and ask away.
I have a question. I want about fiscal sponsorship. I think I heard her say, if you're not a district resident, even like if you get a fiscal sponsor, you also have to be a district resident. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, that is correct. So if you are not a district resident, but you're interested in applying for funding, you can still apply for funding, or still be part of a project rather. What I would recommend is that you either work with a DC-based organization or individual to serve as the applicant on this project. You could still be the project director. You could still be a team member who receives funding for the work that you do in this project, but you wouldn't be able to serve as the applicant. And so I'm happy to talk more offline about how you might go about doing that. We recognize that many DC stories exist on the outskirts of DC or just outside in Maryland and Virginia, and we wish that we could. We want to be able to help fund and tell those stories as well. So one of the ways that you can do that is by partnering with DC-based individuals or organizations who might be willing to serve as the applicant and be part of that project as well. So I hope that answers.
Okay, thank you. My screen is little. Who was that speaking, Leah?
Yeah, that's Leah.
Okay, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Here's my question. So can you all help with determining, like, I'm not good with time. And so how, and it has a start time and a completion time. And right, so sort, yeah, figuring out, okay, how much can actually be done, and if your idea ultimately is an ongoing project, one can start here, maybe to design the program that would be ongoing. I'm talking out loud here, or thinking out loud. So am I making any sense?
Yes. I'll jump in and say, yes, I think you've said exactly that, which is that you would need to define what it would be you would be hoping to complete within that project period. So yes, many applicants apply for ongoing things, and timelines change, and we know that happens. But if you can come with a sense of what you'd be doing within that project period of a year or whatever the project period is, and one of the questions in the application is to define a timeline. So thinking about where would you hope to be in month 1, month 2, month 3, what are you hoping to create or produce in that time period?
And all of the funding that you would receive from HumanitiesDC will have to be spent during that project period. So you might have other sources of funding, which is definitely allowable in the application.
I muted you by accident. I meant to mute myself. Sorry.
In the application on the budget table, there's a column for other sources of funding if you have any other ideas. But but the Humanities DC funding has to be all spent within a certain time period. As for like your specific project and you're not sure what can be done now versus later, we can talk offline to see like what could theoretically be manageable. One other aspect of the application is about team members and collaborators. So you don't absolutely need other people to work with you on it, but that could be another way to be able to get more done in a shorter period of time.
Think you said these slides were going to be sent out. Is that correct?
Yes, so we will, once this is over, we'll take the recording, we'll put it up in YouTube, and we will link to the slides there. And I will make sure this gets sent out to everybody who registered for this session. So you'll have both the video recording and a PDF of the slides.
Okay, here's another question. Do you have any advice about like just how to begin gelling, coming up with some structure? And I guess looking at past projects is I've already done that some, and that's helpful. But I guess just in terms of one's process of thinking through all of this, and maybe it's also just beginning the application, and that helps define. But if you have any games or the right foods to eat.
I think you're on the right track with looking at the application, starting there, and also thinking about past projects. So I recall you were talking about you have you're a photo researcher and you acquired, right, this collection. So maybe you thinking about what first steps or what are some key specifics that you want to achieve, and what feels like a reasonable time period for a year's worth of work. Certainly looking at other grantees and what they've done might be helpful. You can also reach out to them. I'm sure that if you want to set up office hours or ask some more specific questions, I'm sure we can help kind of connect you to some other folks who may have done similar projects. Looking at the application and kind of getting started.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a cop out, but really the application questions do guide you through the whole project. We ask you to be very thoughtful in what you're thinking of the project, the different steps to take. Even if you don't have everything set in stone by the time you actually submit the application, I think seeing the application questions will be able to guide you pretty well. And another option we provide, Leah, I'm sorry if you said this already, but if you wanted to send us a draft application, then Leah or myself can review that application before the actual due date. We won't be able to tell you if you will be funded because, again, that's an external review process, but we can just be an external set of eyes to be able to see, like, does your response make sense? Do we recommend that you talk more about this or that? Is something unclear? As long as you let us know that you would like us to review your draft at least 1 week before the application deadline, we would be happy to do that as well.
Okay, one more question. Uh, one is trained, I assume, to be a reviewer,
Yes.
right? And so, but is that something like if I still wanted to, if could I be a reviewer for this, uh, the newest cycle coming up, or like, can you jump right in?
Yes, so you can be a reviewer for cycle one. If you also want to apply for funding in cycle one, you would just review one of the other grant opportunities. So
Right.
we have 4 grants available in cycle one. So you would review for one of the other 3, depending on your uh, experience and skill sets. We place you thoughtfully into which applications you end up reviewing. But if you wanted to do all of it in cycle one, you're more than welcome to.
We still have time for questions, but I'm just putting this slide up here that has the grants email address. This is monitored hourly, frequently. This is not just some random inbox. So please do email grants@humanitiesdc.org if you have specific questions. Hillary and I are the ones who review that inbox and will respond to you pretty quickly. But you can also email us directly if you prefer.
And
Yeah.
Leah said reach out to you for the fiscal sponsorship question. Should I use this one or your direct email? And if your direct email, what is that?
Sure, you can go ahead and use this email address,
Okay.
the grants@humanitiesdc.org.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions come through. So, like we said, this session will be recorded or is being recorded, and it will be uploaded onto our YouTube and our website. We'll link to it and we'll make sure to send it to you directly with the email address that you registered for this session with. We have additional sessions. We have so much more coming up, as well as the in-person sessions. So please do take a look at those if you want to have more opportunity to kind of speak with us or ask questions. Hi, Edie. That's my daughter.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here tonight. We look forward to hopefully working with you in the future. Again, Leia and I are always available to answer questions. We'll have so many more resources available. We are always available. And we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your night. Take care. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. This was great.